So today we have with us Karin and Tony with DTM Consulting and Applied Geomorphology to talk about channel migration zone study that's been in the works for quite some time. I won't take too much time for introducing them. They can do that themselves, but I think it'd be great if you just went around real quick so they know who they're speaking with. So could do introductions. And Travis Ross with Missoula Valley Water Quality District, part of the Health Department. Chet.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Chet Krauser. I'm the Director of Community and Planning Services for Missoula County.
And Brad. Can't hear you. There you are. Maybe he can't hear me. Brad Watkins.
Hello, I'm Brad Watkins. I'm the resource conservationist for the Missoula Conservation District.
Thanks, Brad. And Sarah. Sarah is in our communications and projects department. And Karin.
Hi, I'm Karin Hughes. I'm with Missoula County Community and Planning Services.
Okay. And Dave and Juan.
Hi.
Hello.
County commissioners out here.
We're missing Josh.
2 out of 3 ain't bad. And Tony, you can introduce yourselves. And Elena.
Yeah, Elena.
Hey, Tim.
Good afternoon, everybody. Tim Hall. I'm the chairman of the Missoula Conservation District. Glad to be aboard.
Thank you. And Shannon.
Hello, I'm Shannon Terrio. I'm the Director of Environmental Health at the City County Health Department.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. And last but not least, Craig.
Hi, I'm Craig. I'm environmental health specialist and GIS specialist with the Water Quality District.
Thanks. And with that, I will pass it over to Tony and Karin.
Hi all, Tony Thatcher with DTM Consulting. Juanita, it's been 35 years since I've seen you. You might remember
Wow.
my sister Leslie more than me.
Oh my goodness. And I was totally, yes, this is wild. Okay.
Conversation for another time. I'm going to pass it off to Karin here. She's going to take the beginning of this and see if we can keep things moving and more condensed than we have in the past. So
here we go. Hi, everybody. My name is Karin Boyd, and I have an office down the hall here. Tony and I are calling in from Bozeman, and we're delighted to meet with you. I just want to give you a heads up that this is part of what we're presenting is cherry picked essentially out of our report to cut to some of the things we thought you might find interesting. The study is countywide. Tony will point that out, but if there are specific areas that you're interested in that we miss, please feel free to get in touch with us, because I think by the end of this, you'll have a pretty good idea of countywide what we've done and some of the things that we've seen. So with that, are we sharing the screen now?
If I can find
I'm taking a picture of you, Tony, for Leslie.
Yeah, I'll get down with the way.
Leslie's daughter is out here in Bozeman with my parents now. We're having dinner with her today.
Love it. Love it.
Okay, and for some reason I can't find the share screen setting there. Here we go. No, that's not it. Racing. Okay. Display settings and no.
We're trying to share a screen here.
Yeah, and I'm not seeing.
You see the little arrow next to the red leave button, the little box with the arrow that points up?
There it is.
Thank you.
sure it's not that intuitive.
All right.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, this is, so just kind of to kick it off, this is I don't know if any of you have seen some of these photos. These were taken by Chris Boyer of Kestrel Aerial during the 2018 flood. And it was terrific that the county had him fly. It really can help us identify some of these hazards. So
Yeah, it does. I thought it was a painting.
yeah, isn't it beautiful? Yeah, those are what we'll describe as some of our avulsion hazards in terms of new channels forming on the floodplain. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so first of all, I think there's sometimes an interest in just talking about the difference between what a floodplain map and what a CMZ map is. And as you know, Missoula County has floodplain maps that are being revised right now and updated. And so fundamentally, a floodplain map is to show where you're going to get flooded out, where you might get your feet wet. Whereas what we're talking about is really where your property or your structure might get wiped out. That means fall in the river. So we're really talking about something very different. In some places they might coincide, and in other places they definitely don't. One of the most important of those is high ground that might be out of the floodplain, but it might still be susceptible to river erosion. So some of the concepts that we're talking about here is to date, this is non-regulatory in Montana, and we've mapped the Yellowstone and the Upper Missouri, and we've, which included probably 6 rivers. So there's been a lot of mapping from the Big Hole to the Ruby to the Madison to the Jefferson. And to date, it's been really non-regulatory. It has been used to kind of help with planning efforts and sometimes to kick proposed developments into a higher level of review. But certainly, unlike places like Washington State and more recently Colorado has taken it on, it's not as heavily used as a regulatory tool in Montana as elsewhere. Oh, do you want me to do that? And it's really, as you'll see, it's really empirical. It's based on mapping historic channels and measuring rates of movement, making some decisions about reach breaks and geology, but it's really based upon things that are very visual. And one of the things I hope you'll come away with is that it's really quite intuitive and understanding. It makes sense, and it makes sense to landowners, which is one of the most valuable things. The scale that we do it at, it's quite cost effective. We do it where we do, literally, you can do a whole county at once. We're not looking at a single location on the river where we're looking at a huge amount of detail. We're looking at river process in more of a zoomed out scale, so it's quite cost effective. And again, we use it as a tool to help management decisions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in terms of what we've seen in Montana in terms of how it's been applied in that way. So the 2 types of things we're going to talk about relevant to both the Clark Fork and the Bitterroot are the processes of channel migration, which is shown here as Benway migration, and then avulsion. And migration is basically the marching of a channel across its floodplain, where you can see a point bar developing here with a big cut bank. And so this river is moving in this direction, in this case, to a bunch of berry fields in Washington State. And so you can actually measure that rate of movement. It tends to be fairly incremental, although it can be fast, as you'll see. But then the other process we look at is a little more difficult to predict. It's called an avulsion, and that's where typically during a flood, if you have an old swale out on the floodplain, sometimes ditches, sometimes tributaries, sometimes just finding a shorter route, you'll have what's called an avulsion, which is the rapid creation of a new channel in the floodplain. So when we start doing this, we need to look at a bunch of things. One is that how channels move depends greatly on the conditions in which they're in. And one of those things is the materials that it's migrating into. So up on the left here, this is the terrace down at Kelly Island, and it's not huge. It's not a 30-foot terrace, but it's higher than the floodplain across the way. And these tend to be comprised of different materials than you'll see in more recent alluvial deposits. You know, sometimes we'll see glacial materials, but anyway, typically those types of areas, they migrate slower than others. And so we look at geologic maps and we map these features when we're thinking about how to predict risk of channel movement into a given area. And then this is coming down below town, the south bank. You can see it's basically a big bedrock wall. And so we actually have quite a few areas where the river is up against rock that's not erodible at all. And as you'll see when we go through the mapping, we clip those things out. So we do take all those things into account when we do the mapping. The other thing we take into account is the flood history. Sometimes we're concerned if people want to do one of these maps with, 10 or 20 years worth of historic knowledge of what's happened out there, just because if you haven't had any big water, in the early 2000s, most of the rivers in Montana constricted during the drought, and they actually shrank. And if we had done channel migration maps based on those 5 years, you'd see hardly any change at all. So we always look at the flood history to make sure that we've had some action out there. And in this case, you can see going back, we start in the mid-50s with our mapping right here. And we haven't had any, this is below Missoula, we haven't had any 100-year events out here, but we've had quite a few 10 to 25-year events that have done a lot of work, as you know, on the river. And so we feel confident that we're capturing a fair amount of geomorphic work being done out there. The other thing that's important, as well as the peak with channel movement, for sure, is the duration of the floods. And we've had some pretty long duration events. So we do feel like we're capturing these kind of typical corridors for river movement.
All right. So we started these CMZ mapping process in Missoula County with a pilot study back in 2009. And in the intervening years, we've done about 4 or so other updates to it, where we've developed data for the Bitterroot River or farther up the Clark Fork River. And so really what this effort was focused on is integrating all that work that we've done before into a cohesive single data set, bringing it up to current methodologies that we've been using on rivers throughout Montana, and that other folks have been using around the US, and also bring it up to date with as current imagery as we could get to with the available imagery. So what we're presenting here is really the summation of all those previous efforts and bringing it up to current date.
So that's, hey, just going back to that last slide, is that third bullet supposed to be methodology, not mythology?
Nice. That's
very
nice.
good.
What the hell are we paying for here?
It's all voodoo anyway.
Oh my goodness.
That's a classic. Very good. Okay, we're going to leave that in there just to as a text.
First person who's tried that.
That's awesome. Anyway, Missoula County, this is on the Clark Fork and the Bitterroot Rivers, 68 miles of the Clark Fork River and 23 miles. My ears are red. That's great. So real quickly, just so you can understand how these things are developed and why they're so kind of understandable to landowners and general public and whatnot, is we just look at where the river has been by looking at historic imagery. So that's a historic migration zone. Based on where the river has moved and the rates that it's moved, we use that information to anticipate future erosion on bank lines. So past being the key to the future. And then we look at these areas that Karin mentioned, these avulsion hazards, where the river might quickly jump into a whole new area by taking a shorter path or getting into a floodplain swale or those kinds of things. So we're looking at kind of 3 different zones here. Where the river has been, and we figure it's probably going to be there again, where it might migrate to into the future, and then these stochastic events that might happen in floods or ice jams or things like that. So real quick, 1955 imagery, and in green, those are the bank lines and islands mapped for an area downstream of Missoula here. And we did that same mapping for all the suites of imagery. So this is the most current data, 2017. And again, we map all the islands and the bankful channels. And those are areas where the river gets to every year or two, and it basically keeps the vegetation off the bars And so it's pretty clear indicators that the river is actively getting to those parts of the channel.
We went to 2019.
Yeah,
We did have
yep.
2019
Yeah.
imagery too, yeah.
Yeah. And so we take all those imagery, those bankline data sets, and we put them together. So we can see 55, 72, 5, 2011, 2017, and then 2018/2019, depending on where you are in the river. And we merge those all together, and that creates the historic footprint of the river, or the historic migration zone. And that integrates the islands, any islands that are sitting in there too. So we pretty much know the river has been there and is going to be there in the future, likely. Next is looking at that future movement of the river. And this is where we take the oldest bank lines, which are 1955 in green, and the most current bank lines that we've mapped, which are the 2018, 2019 data set in blue. And we draw all these measurements, these vectors. And then, so those are where we know the river is actively moving into a bank line. And it's not something that's jumped in an evulsive process. And then we look at those, we do a bunch of statistical analysis based on the characteristics of the area that's in. So we break up the river into a whole bunch of different reaches. And so you can see these, kind of canyon areas up at the upper end of the Clark Fork are going to behave much differently than the area downstream around the Kona Bridge and stuff like that. Much broader valley. So we want to make sure that we're doing statistics and creating future erosion zones that reflect the activities that are happening within those reaches. So that's what we're seeing here is the Bitterroot River on the left was broken into two reaches, and the Clark Fork from upstream at Beavertail Rock here at CF1 all the way down to CF10, which is down Frenchtown and to the county line. And these are the migration distance measurements from 55 to 2019. And you can see each reach has a different kind of characteristic, and some of them have more outliers where the river has moved pretty quickly over that time period or a significant distance. But we tend to look at these statistics here to help us choose, in this case with you guys, with Travis and Elena, select a distance or statistic that we can apply to the river, and that will identify future channel migration. And we call that the erosion hazard area, and that's what we're seeing here in yellow. So it's reach based. We can see that this buffer was on this reach was different than just the reach downstream, just getting slightly narrower downstream. And those buffers get placed on the outside of the most recent bank lines that we've had. So here in dark blue, we can see the most recent bank line and a buffer placed on the outside of it. But on this side, you can see that the historic migration zone, that footprint of where the channel has been, actually trumps the erosion buffer in this area here. So we have these areas where you don't see any erosion buffer, but we know the river has already been there, and the river is on the other side of the valley at this point in time.
Okay, so maybe I'm confused, Tony. So the river is moving in that last slide. It's in the lower right-hand corner. It's moving to the east, but when you said it trumps, I guess so are you more concerned about where the farms are?
Yeah, no, so there's a buffer that's placed on either side on all banks of the most current bank line mapping. This dark blue.
Okay. I was thinking it was just on one bank. I gotcha.
No,
okay.
No. And so you can see it's on the outside of this bank line here, and also on the outside of this bank line here. It's also on the going into the island area, but that's all historic migration zone in there. So the historic migration zone always is going to trump the an erosion buffer.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
It's yeah, and so this is we take we convert our statistics to an annual feet per year rate and multiply that by 100 years, and so this is anticipating 100 years of future channel migration. Okay. The next step is looking at these areas where the river might jump into and avulse into these channels. In this case, these white arrows here are historic floodplain swales. So these are old channels, pre-1955 channels that, given the right conditions, if this channel starts taking on a lot of water for one reason or another, and it starts eroding in this direction, it might jump into one of these channels, and this could become the dominant channel of the Clark Fork River or the Bitterroot River in the future. And so those are those big, whoa, okay, what do we do about this? But it's definitely a hazard, and the conditions need to be right for them to happen, but they definitely do happen. Karin will show you some of those. The last step that we do is we take whatever bank armor that we know or physical restrictions like roads and levees and things like that, and we identify those areas beyond them. So the bank armor here is these dots, and you can see behind it is an area that's crosshatched. And we consider those areas having restricted channel migration. There is some level of protection to them right now, but we don't really know what characteristics of that bank armor is. Is it just some small rock that was thrown in there by a farmer? Was it actually engineered for some particular flood? But we've seen in pretty much every situation this armor fails at some point in time, and so we never consider it hard and fast unless it's an engineered levee certified by the Corps of Engineers. And one final step that we do is, you can see this is one of those unerodable bedrock walls here, and we just clip those out. We haven't seen the channel move into those areas at all. It's not going to erode appreciably in the next 100 years into those areas, so we just clip those out of the mapping completely. And what we end up with is a composite map that includes all those elements. And in some other jurisdictions, some states in the Pacific Northwest, basically will just give you this orange outline here as the channel migration zone, and they regulate within that. We find it really helpful to include all the pieces that went into that. So the avulsion hazard area, the historic migration zone, the erosion buffers, stuff like that. So you can kind of understand and explain the level of hazard and the type of hazard in those areas. And we applied the same methodology all the way up and down the river, so the symbology is consistent, the maps are all consistent. The thing that varies is that the erosion rates tend to change within those within each reach, so you get a bit larger buffer where there's been more erosion, a smaller buffer where there's less erosion. Karen's going to kind of take you for a blitz tour down the river here. We're going to skip some of the places that were sort of interesting, but in that reach, but don't really have a lot of impact or management considerations, and just highlight the low-hanging fruit, as we say.
Yeah, so I think we have 11 reaches, and there's a little subchapter in the report that describes, we walk through each reach and talk about the various things that we've seen, but I'm going to go up one here. When I start, I'm going to start at Tura and start working downstream, but this is up at Beavertail, and when you're in the upper part above Clinton, well, in that whole area, really coming down to Bonner, what the CMZ maps really show is all the confinement by the transportation infrastructure in combination with the canyon walls. I mean, it's just remarkable how much of the historic floodplain has been isolated by those features. So it's pretty much put the squeeze on the CMZ up there, and a lot of that infrastructure is quite old. So we end up with a narrow corridor. And in 2018, in a few places where it wasn't confined, it really blew out. And I think there are some things to think about on that section of the river where it is so artificially confined that you get some pretty big responses in other areas that can be dramatic. But But we're going to jump down again. That stuff's in the report. You can go one more. We're going to jump down and we're going to start at our third reach, which is near Tura Bridge, and it captures that a little bit. You can see the river. It's following the South Valley Wall, and then it comes in. Here's these maps I'm showing you with these color ramps. These are relative elevation maps, and so basically we were able to, with the LiDAR data, Tony can take the elevations and just do a relative map so that the colors reflect how close vertically the ground is to the water surface of the Clark Fork River. So everything that's blue is really low ground. Everything that gets warmer and warmer is higher ground. So it really helps us, and the resolution is such, you know, you can see old channels on the other side of the interstate, which are completely cut off from the CMZ because this is so old, the infrastructure. But you can also see other areas that help us identify the nature of old channels and avulsion hazards and things like that, and how connected the floodplain is in general. But at any rate, coming down, I'm going to focus on two areas. That one right here just shows a really common challenge with CMZ management, and that's old infrastructure where the old railroad grade crosses the river at a high angle. And then the other is just below Tura Bridge, where the channel follows along the interstate and then crosses over. And then in that area where it's less confined becomes really quite dynamic. Upstream though, near Clinton, there was a big avulsion that was pretty impressive too, a big meander cutoff in last year. So this is that railroad grade. Here's the grade coming down. The river is flowing in this direction. And this is one thing we commonly see, and it's really challenging, especially with abandoned infrastructure that's not necessarily maintained, is the alignment. The alignment when this was built was probably much better, where the river was going right through the bridge. It's since migrated in this direction, and now it just doglegs against the old railroad grade, which is armored, as you can see, but it really got into it in 2018 and had to be repaired. And so now as the channel goes through, it doglegs, flows along. These become really rough hydraulic environments, which I'll show you one down at Smurfett Stone, where the river essentially T-bones some hard feature, and then it has to come through and make the turn to go up to the north. So in terms of management, you go ahead, Tony. In terms of management, it gets tricky because we have a CMZ that's probably 1,000 feet wide, and down here we're getting down to maybe 1/10 of that, where you got to squeeze it through this tight spot where we have these old bridge abutments. So it can just be a difficult thing because everyone's used to this feature being here, and it's kind of it will probably continue to require repair in the future just because it's a tough configuration. And then coming down, so this is looking upstream. Here's the interstate coming towards Bonner, and you can see when the interstate and the railroads and the frontage road, when all those were built, there was a lot of channelization of the Clark Fork. And so currently there's places where it just runs right along it. And that's not uncommon, where it'll kind of stick to a hard valley wall. It'll form a pretty deep cross section. And then here you can see it comes across and does the same thing against the railroad grade here on the south side. But in these areas in the middle, right here, this high water, there's head cuts that have formed. And so this area is in the process of avulsing right through here, whereas the channel used to come down in this direction. So this there's a certain amount of land loss in this area, but also a brand new channel forming. Coming further down below Milltown, Milltown is kind of neat because the REM shows that that restoration project was low. That was built as a floodplain reconnection project. We don't have any mapping there because there's no migration to be had because it's a brand new channel. But we're 10 years now. I just want to put in a plug in. You guys should be proud of that work at Milltown because it's a pretty impressive project from a floodplain function perspective. Anyway, we come down super confined as you come in to Missoula, and then you can see how much it widens out down here. We have you can't hardly measure migration in this area, of course, because it's just an urban river through town. And so there's really not a lot since the 50s that we can see in terms of dynamism of the Clark Fork until we get to Reserve and the gravel pit. I just wanted to point that out. So this is Reserve Street. You can see on the bottom, this is the same location in the 70s. And you can see back then that was just a big scalping of a giant old point bar that extended from this area on the upstream end of it all the way down in this area. And so since then, so 72 to 2019, you can see it's been consolidated, that gravel pit that you see upstream of Reserve. And there's currently a big dike here that separates it from the river. And one of the things that's the most interesting to me is that this low area that was all excavated, it's still quite low in here. And this bank, the right bank of the river, is fully armored. And so during high water, this is what you saw, was a lot of water coming through these channels and basically being pulled down through these lower channels. And the next slide shows that, the relative elevation model. And you can see these purples, here's the river channel overlaying the active channels, but those other bridges on Reserve Street that in the lower left here, you can see flowing during the flood.
That's
It's
an
difficult.
amazing photo.
Wow.
Well, and it's hard to tell the flow paths. I mean, a lot of this could be backwatering. I don't know if you guys saw, Travis, if you saw, this certainly looks like river water. It doesn't look like groundwater alone, but there's definitely interaction between the river and the gravel pit here. And these channels are real, you know?
Yeah. Look at Salter's. Sorry, we're just geeking out on this a little bit.
Yeah, we've got a side project that we're engaged in with this parcel here.
Oh, good. Well, you know,
Dramatic.
well, yeah, and there's really nowhere to go along this whole right bank. It's all armored. And so at high water, this is what would typically absolutely be inundated by the river. Now there's a gravel pit with a dike, and it's, I would just anticipate, yeah, that you're going to continue at high water to see those activate readily.
Karin, I'm sorry, as a side, can you send us, whose photo is this?
That one is Chris Boyers from Kestrel aerial. Yeah.
But Travis, it doesn't Travis on it?
Yeah,
Someone
Travis,
send it to Travis?
you have,
Travis, can you send it to us?
Yeah. We have a.
Thanks. Okay, awesome. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Okay, let's keep going downstream then. So then we get to Kelly Island, which is pretty exciting. Oh, we didn't leave the Milltown Dam. One thing I'll just digress here for a minute. One thing we looked at was whether Milltown Dam removal affected migration rates, because there has been, you know, a big slug of sediment comes down. And if you're interested in that, have a look at it when we get the report all finalized. But fundamentally, we cannot see a big response of Milltown Dam removal on the rates of movement of the Clark Fork. So I'll just leave it at that right now. So coming into Kelly Island, the three areas, this is an old railroad grade. There's also a utility line that crosses the river right here. Again, here's Reserve, here's the gravel pit on the far right. And then this is, again, older infrastructure where there's some old bridge piers and some challenges there. This is the Tree Farm and Schmidt Road where the trailer was lost during the flood, if you might recall, right there. And then this is down at Orchard Homes, where I know you have chronic flooding issues. So we just want to focus in on those three. So first, we'll talk about this one on the upper end. So this is looking downstream towards Orchard Homes. Here's the river coming, and this, again, is that old railroad grade. Here's abandoned piers, and there's a utility pole right here. And it's the very same thing that we were looking at up at Tura, which is the orientation of the river to these hard structures is not good. And so there's a risk. We were talking about this previously about Missoula County's plan to what to do with this crossing in terms of whether it could be an amenity to the community. And there's certainly some risk of flanking of this feature right here. This utility pole, which is rocked, you can see all the high velocity right here. That's in a pretty dicey spot. And there was one utility pole that got wiped out, I think right here during the flood. Is that where it was, Travis? Do you see where it was around this bend?
Yeah, I think that was it. Yep, it was downstream of this crossing.
Is this the Tower of Nature area?
Yeah, still, well, maybe a little farther down.
Oh, okay.
So,
wow, this is.
So, does anyone on the line here know what WGM was proposing a year or so ago? This was before Brent Campbell left the company. He was pitching some idea to do something at this very location. to mitigate flood hazard. Does that ring a bell to anyone, or maybe it was just the commission who was in on that? Okay, never mind.
No, sorry, Dave, it's Chris. What he was proposing was an extension of the existing levee.
Okay, I could have that too. I could have sworn that he was pitching something with this old railroad grade through here, but
yeah, he was.
Anyway.
He mentioned that to us out on site when we were down at Kerwald, while he was also pitching extending the levee.
Okay.
So Dave, I appreciate you saying that, because people ask us, well, what should we do? And my response was always, someone should look at this a little more carefully. Because, you know, if it's possible, the nice thing is that there are flood relief channels through here that are active. So that's a good thing ecologically in terms of stream power, but there's just some very site-specific areas of high scour that I think you want to make sure with respect to your utility lines and the potential implications of water getting behind the end of this armor, things like that. So something to keep an eye on. Okay, and then moving downstream, so this is coming down to Schmidt Road, and this is kind of neat. This shows in green the 1950s channel trace, and in blue is 2011, and this is on a 2019 air photo. So obviously this has migrated about over 900 feet of migration since the 50s towards the north. And then since then, what you see, and this is really typical, is once you get a big meander developed, the worst erosion isn't here, it's right here. It tends to be on the apex and on the downstream limb as these benways, they translate, we call it translation downstream, and that happened to be right where that mobile home was that got taken out. So now we're starting to see this benway move down in this direction. And so this is another power line. So I think the one we were just pointing out that was lost was right in here. And you can see this power line where it comes, the river is up against it, and it's actually migrating in this direction as well. So wherever these utilities are crossing the river corridor, especially in dynamic areas like this, like Kelly Island, I'd certainly want to keep an eye on where the fixed points are, where the poles are. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that right here it says avulsion prone area, and Travis and Elena had noted this to us. There's basically a deep hole right in here that this is migrating into this old 50s channel, and there's a strong potential for more and more water going, as the river migrates in that direction into that old channel, for more and more water to be going down there more and more frequently. So that becomes an avulsion hazard there. Schmidt Road is a very, very interesting place. Okay. So, this actually shows it. So this is a relative elevation model. Here's Schmidt Road. Here's that benway that migrated to the north so far. And here's that low old channel that, again, as the river migrates towards it, it starts intercepting the head of that. And we see that a lot, where suddenly the bank, as it gets into this channel, this bank elevation is going to get lower and lower, and more water will just spill into it. And so once you get a higher frequency of more water going in, that channel has a high risk of being captured. But in the meantime, there's also the potential for this little channel to activate and bring more water. This channel here is largely abandoned. Well, it's not really, I don't know, it's a high flow channel currently, but this, which is coming down towards South 3rd Street West, I think you could anticipate seeing more water in coming years as well as this bend migrates to the west. Okay, and then the first thing, I think, when you zoom in and start looking at the Orchard Homes, there's a lot of blue. There's a lot of low ground at Orchard Homes. And so we were tasked with looking at the risk, and we know that you've had a lot of concern with flooding in this area. So we were tasked with looking at the risk of channel migration in this area. And this is actually the dike that comes down, and I think we learned recently that there is armor that extends along here, but not up here. Is that right? To right here. And you can see this old swale that goes behind to the south, right through the neighborhood. So that was isolated from the river in the 50s. So when Tony mapped all the channels, we only mapped those active channels. So that basically was taken out of play from the channel migration map. It is, there's some avulsion hazard area over here, but essentially what we find is that we cannot demonstrate this being at risk of the channel getting in there, but it's absolutely, as you know, it's a flood risk. And I think the next slide shows that with the CMZ. So here's the neighborhood. Here's our CMZ coming down. And so it's just based on our measured rates of movement, we would not predict the river to be into orchard homes in the next century. However, the next slide shows that there's certainly water in there.
It does get wet there.
Whether it's groundwater, whether it's flood water. And so it's one of those things where the flood maps and our CMZ maps don't follow the same boundary based upon our predictions of channel movement.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of different risks.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a couple other areas just upstream of here below the Bitterroot confluence, but we're gonna jump down to Kona Bridge into Council Grove. And I wanted to show this. I think you all might be familiar with this project I'm going to show downstream of Kona Bridge on the right. There's another place right here. This is called Warm Slough on old maps. I don't know that you guys still call it Warm Slough. And then this is the trailer park on the wagon wheel trailer park, I think, down on the south side. So looking at those barbs, this is on the right bank below Kona Bridge. This is 95. And there's a lot of discussion about barbs and their efficacy in a river that is as dynamic as the Clark Fork. The main issue, well, there's a couple. One is actually how they're constructed and the types of hydraulics they might create in between them. The other is the fact that when you build them for a given alignment for the river approaching them. So in many cases, the alignment of the river will change. And what was following a nice path to begin with, the next thing you know, currents are going right in between your barbs and scalloping them out. So you can see in 2019, they've actually had to go in, and I believe these have been re-armored, these big scallops between the barbs. But it's a pretty good example of a lot of money being thrown at this location to protect what looks like some pretty valuable property right on the outside of a bendway where we're seeing really rapid natural rates of movement. It has an interesting history. And then coming down to Council Grove, I was looking at the imagery, and this is 1972, and you can see it had been blocked off. There's a little dike here that goes across, and it's probably 500 feet, 600 feet wide, something like that. And it's since eroded out. So these are the kind of things that we can say, and Warm Slough is certainly becoming more active now than it was in the 70s. So this is the kind of stuff that's really helpful, I think, in outreach, whether it's landowners or developers, to just, it's an eyes wide open thing in terms of the history. So in our strong feeling is that this is so much more about the map than the maps. It's really about the stories of what we've seen through time, and that it can really help, hopefully, people voluntarily make some good decisions out there. Okay, coming down to the Wagon Wheel Trailer Village, which is right here. I've gotten some calls over the years regarding this spot, and we're looking at over 850 feet-ish of movement since the 50s, but it also migrated over 100 feet in the last several years. And this is a bendway. You can see the big open point bar in the shape of this bend, which is a big, broad, sweeping meander. Meanders tend to kind of evolve where there's a time when they migrate really rapidly, and then as they get tighter and tighter, they'll slow down. This is kind of in the perfect configuration to have really rapid rates of movement, as long as these materials out here are erodible and amenable to it. So this is another area where I think continued erosion, and there's an old slough back here that it could get into, but we're looking at half a mile of bank that is quite a bit at risk in this area. We're going to jump down now to Smurfit. We've spent a fair bit of time. We spoke with Travis and Elena in the group down in Frenchtown about Smurfit and the CMZ, because it's just a really interesting intersection of a giant floodplain development that is full of all these berms that, you know, intersects with the CMZ. And we're just going to hit a couple of main things here to hopefully drive home the primary things that we've seen. But I went through all the permit applications historically, and you can really see there's been a lot of effort put in certain areas, and it makes sense as to why that has happened. This is the relative elevation map again, and here are the various berm. This is called the outer berm, the yellow and black one, the CFR berm, right? And then the inner berm. And then there's all these other dissecting lagoon-based berms that create these ponds. And this is pond number 2 right here. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And right down here at the lower end is pond number 13A that we'll show you a little bit about as well. So, of course, you can see that all these low swales back underneath the lagoons, that's old CMZ. Some of these channels were active in the 50s, and so they are in the channel migration zone. So the berms have essentially confined the river, and then we have the valley wall on the south side, which makes it a pretty narrow corridor through there. And I pulled this. This is an application from 1978, and this has kind of been the story continually, in that there have been areas. This was an application for 3,250 feet of riprap in several different areas that have been problematic. Ultimately, there's a lot more armor out there, and there's also been a lot of maintenance. There's been a fair bit of repeat repair jobs out there as well. So one of them I want to talk about is it right up here at pond number 2, and this, of course, is where it's the head of the. It's, what do we say? Where the python's eating the pig is what we call it. It's just all the sediment is coming down, has to squeeze right through here. So, and this is what it looks like during high water. And again, this used to be an active channel in the 70s, and they armored all along here. And so that Benway cut off. And so an area that's taken it right now is right in this deflection point at the upper end of the main constriction part, going down into the ponds. And that's a picture from 1991. And here's pond number 2. And again, you can see the river is coming, and it's just hammering this area bank. And so they've had to go in. First it was armored, and then they put these 2 little barbs in here. And so it's just been an area of challenging and repeat. You can see the different colors of the armor. So there's basically been extensions and reinforcements. So it's sort of an area that you would predict that would be at odds, because it's essentially at the head of an hourglass of the channel migration zone. Jumping downstream, this is pond 13A, and you can probably get a sense of what the issue is here, where this basically comes out at a right angle. So this is looking upstream. Here's pond number 2 with that problem area. There's been quite a bit of work done on this section. And then right here, we have overflows coming back and running right into the berm that protects this 13A little cell here. And there's armor that's mapped up above, and the armor follows this old bank line, but currently high flows are getting behind the armor. And so that is something that it can be a problem, just because it creates, it'll tear out the armor, and then, you know, you can see more pressure against this. But the other thing that's really interesting here is that this pond 13A, again, this is where they've had boils that they've had to repair. So, oh goodness, it's happened a couple of times where there was basically boils are water was coming under the berm and basically forming these erosive boils where it was coming to the surface. And the fear then is it's going to the berm's going to fail. Mm-hmm. And so they went in, and
the rodents are in there.
Well, they have had some rodent burrow problems as well, but these were described as being a hydraulic conductivity underneath the berm. And what's interesting about that is that these outfalls, this is a 1955 channel, and that's where outfall number 1 is. This is a 1955 channel, and this is where outfall number 3 is. And both of these old channels, they're old channel deposits. And so it's not perhaps surprising that there's a whole bunch of gravel in here that's gonna, and they describe in the seepage study that the gravels underneath, you know, contribute to this issue of hydraulic conductivity and water coming under the berm and then rising back up on the downstream side. Okay, and then the last one, this is below Smurfit towards Frenchtown, and I just want to show one area in here, and it's right here around River Mile 192 and 193 by the Frenchtown Golf Course. Looking downstream in this area, boy, the floodplain is just incredible with all these swales and water getting on the other side of the road. And so the CMZ below Smurfit, which was totally confined, widens dramatically, and you can see all this riparian regeneration. It's really dynamic, and ecologically it's a really functional place, but it's also problematic in some ways as well, because here we are, this is 1972, and this is kind of similar to that avulsion potential up by Schmidt Road, and that the river's migrating into this whole channel. And sure enough, since then, you can see in 2018 it's completely blown through. And this was a mile-long avulsion where the entire river is now following this whole channel. And it's a pretty striking change, you know, especially when these things will literally happen during a single event, and the river is suddenly a half a mile away from where it was originally. On the, just as an aside, on the Musselshell in 2011, they had 59 avulsions that shortened the river by about 30 miles. River lost 10% of its length during a single flood in 2011. So for water users, and then, you know, people who live down here managing golf course, there's always a post-adjustment phase that can be difficult. So understanding and anticipating and maybe coping or maybe managing, however you want to deal with these things, can be important. But what's interesting with this one is sometimes we see a domino effect where you see one happen and it sets you up for another one. And one of the concerns here, so here's 2018, is this, in this direction, it's getting into another swale and ditch, which you can see there, and you can see it up here. Here's the relative elevation map. So we're starting to see water spill. This is looking, you know, flow is right to left. Here we're looking upstream, and this is where that water is just pouring out on that brand new Benway and getting into these old channels. So we could very well see another another big event causing another big change down there by Frenchtown. We can go into discussion here quickly. We just want to toss out some things to think about, maybe as discussion points. Some of the things that we see as potential management strategies. One is, you know, as we can we just stay out of the CMZ where possible, and where we know that, especially transportation infrastructure, we got to cross rivers. So where we do, whether it's railroad or highway or whatever, driveway, whether we can kind of taper the CMZ into those narrow openings rather than creating these dog legs that create a real problem for maintenance. And that's what MDT is thinking about, doing that more on other systems, like on the Musselshell, where they actually don't just deal with the absolute bridge area. They actually look upstream and they say, look, how are we going to funnel this into our into the bridge opening? So, but if we can minimize the encroachment, taper the CMZ, for example, and then we can allow for some movement to increase resilience. And, you know, Tony and I bang this drum a little bit. The ecological function of our cottonwood corridor dominated rivers in Montana absolutely rely on rivers moving around, because if we don't have the migration, we don't get open bars, and those open bars are where the cottonwood seedlings or willows, everything colonizes. And rivers all around the West that are fully locked in place, the cottonwoods are dying out. They're 150 years old, and there's no little trees. And so there's a lot of value in at least defining a man-made corridor that you can allow some movement. That's not just the channel, but it's a corridor. So that comes as to where could we potentially expand the corridor width? Coming back to the Musselshell, the town of Roundup just did this. They pulled a giant levee and reincorporated and built a park down in the CMZ by pulling out a levee. So they were tired of maintaining it. They didn't want to pay this stuff that nobody really cared about anymore. So they decided to strategically reincorporate it into the CMZ. So, and then when confining infrastructure is slated for improvements like a road, sometimes we'll be asked to help them locate the road to set it back a decent way, mostly in an attempt to save money in the long term for maintenance. And then consolidating infrastructure, one thing that seems to work really well, and we didn't see this, you guys, there's quite a few irrigation structures, but a lot of small irrigation structures that are sprinkled all over some of our big rivers. These poor landowners, they're putting their flag in the ground on a single spot to keep the river there, and it can be really difficult. So when we can consolidate infrastructure, we always look at that. So basically you have fewer areas where you're so committed to having the river located. Woody riparian growth, Tony and I, when we did the Yellowstone, we actually cut the migration vectors up in terms of what kind of ground it was going through. Was it a hayfield or was it a riparian corridor? And you could show that the rivers were migrating more slowly through a woody bottom rather than a hayfield. So that kind of helps with riparian buffers, can help temper those migration rates. Some buried infrastructure, pipelines, utility towers. You can imagine that pipelines are a big deal, not only from scour from a riverbed, but there's a lot of examples of channels migrating laterally and exposing pipelines that are following the river parallel. So now when they're burying crossings, they're giving it more room on the sides. If you directionally drill a pipeline, they're widening the deep section of the pipeline to allow for some river movement. And same with pipelines that run parallel. And yeah, that comes to this last one, which is when we see projects that run right out into the CMZ, just the examples I showed you where at some point the river's going to be T-boning, you know, a rock structure that's sticking out into the axis of the CMZ. Those fail a lot. They require a lot of maintenance, and they also can create cascading effects. So anything we can do that's basically parallel to the CMZ, the better. Not the channel, but the CMZ axis, right? And so I just wanted to show this real quickly. This was a project I've been working on in Washington State, same thing. A lot of costs for levee maintenance out there, big levees coming off of, this is the Nooksack River that comes off of Mount Baker and dumps into Bellingham Bay at Bellingham. And so basically across the bottom are all these different levees, and they all are associated with a level of constriction of the corridor. And so some of them, the corridor is 1/2 mile wide here, and some of them it's 600 feet, which is very narrow for the Nooksack River. So we just sorted these in terms of how narrow the corridor is where they are. And then we looked at the number of times it had been maintained. And so this twin view constriction is 600 feet wide, and every foot of levee has been maintained 3.4 times. So that has been a very high maintenance cost on that one because it's a super narrow corridor. And then if you sort these, the general trend is that the wider the corridor, the less intense the which makes sense, right? The less intense the maintenance is. But it's a nice kind of compelling cost argument that kind of, you know, ties in with ecological function and resiliency and all these things as we go through time. So finally, we have seen these used in several different ways, and we're excited to see how Missoula County can use these in your work. Certainly outreach is a big application, buyer beware, education. We've had developers call and asked us to help them put, you know, identify where their green space should be on the Yellowstone, and we can actually hand them, we don't need to tell them, we can send them a map that shows them the history, shows them the rates of movements, and they can see it themselves. So that's kind of the buyer beware part. And then from a planning perspective, you know, the landowners and agencies and placing structures and septic sanitarians have used this information to help landowners place their septic systems, which has been good. And they've also been used to develop projects. On the Yellowstone, we've implemented 2 channel migration easements, which is basically landowners who don't have the money to protect a hayfield or even a beet field. They're being paid to put a channel migration easement on that essentially dedicates that ground to be river bottom. They can still farm, they can still do whatever, they just can't armor the banks. And there's been a lot of interest in it, and they're trying to raise money to keep that program going. So we'll see what happens with that. And then of course, easements, restoration, mitigation projects for reactivating side channels, things like that in terms of fisheries. We can map those side channels so you can kind of identify the ones that might be the lowest hanging fruit for reactivation. And then various types of resiliency, and that's reopening low floodplain areas that basically act as part of your alluvial, part of your sponge to absorb water, to you know, make our alluvial system less efficient at exporting water, so we start absorbing them in a broader area where we're not doubling up with flood risk as a consequence in a neighborhood or something like that. So I think that brings us to an end.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's a lot to absorb.
That's amazing. This is fantastic. Thank you so much. Or terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's yeah, as Karin said, it's definitely an eyes wide open kind of thing, and we start showing these. We showed these maps to old time ranchers and whatnot, and they're going, "Yep, yeah, I used to hay that back in the 50s, you know, or that used to be like this, and yeah, it doesn't surprise me." And you show it to a new landowner who's totally freaked out because they bought their little piece of paradise, and now they're looking at a $500,000 riprap bill if they can even get the permit to do it. So, yeah, we've seen tears of sad sorrow and tears of joy when somebody consulted us and then ended up setting their house back 150 feet from where they originally putting it, and they came back to us a year later and said thank you.
No kidding.
Yeah, that was on the big wall.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess before we have to split here, and there will be, I think, a lot of conversations on our end to figure out how to apply some of this very useful information. Does anyone out there on Missoula County's end have any last thoughts?
We have started to share this with various departments. So we've had a couple of sessions with Karin and Tony, and with development services and CAPS, public works. So we're just starting to kind of get the word out and think about next steps. The Water Quality Advisory Council, Conservation District boards have heard this as well. Sarah is on here as well and recorded this presentation. So we'll be starting to brainstorm how to best get this out to the public. Talking with Anna Conley, our attorney, later this week about how to properly put the map out there and word the disclaimer, as you can imagine. But yeah, I'm open to, I would love to hear ideas on next steps for implementation. We're talking about it with Jenny Dixon and the zoning regs as well. So,
well, Travis, maybe Travis and Todd, and I guess just about everyone has some interest in this. Maybe we need to schedule a follow-up meeting to debrief a little. I know that this was a piece of the discussion related to Orchard Homes area and flooding issues out there, and this has been pretty instructive for me, at least, seeing how channel migration applies or does not apply for that particular geographic area. So I know this has been something we've been waiting for a while, and it will be good to debrief a little in terms of next steps in that neck of the woods.
Yeah, absolutely. The county 10 years ago or so took a stab at streamside setbacks, which are so important in this environment. And I think it may be an opportune time to start really looking at that.
Yeah, Travis, I'd offer the Gallatin County Commissioners, Tony and I presented the Gallatin work, and they have been using it for focusing on some of the established setback requirements. It's been nice. I mean, they've been using it as a tool, which has been great to see. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's good data, and it's hard to argue with.
I know, Travis, you've also talked about riparian zone and how that might fit into the planning world. And then Dave and Juanita, we also want to think about it in terms of septic permitting, so we have distances that are required for floodplain and flood prone areas, but it's it's kind of shocking when the river just takes your septic system. So, yeah. So I'm not, it's hard because it's a really big zone in some areas, but it's also, we're just seeing the effects after that recent flood of people really losing a lot of property. So want to think about that too. I love the idea of a debrief.
Hey, I want to butt in here before we check out on behalf of the Conservation District Board of Supervisors. I really want to thank Travis and the Water Quality District and the consultants for doing such a wonderful job. The Board of Supervisors were duly impressed, as I think the commissioners are. And I want to, sorry about that, I'm having a little trouble with my phone. There you go. It's great to look at things at 10,000 feet or 1,000 feet and really see what the possibilities and emergencies might be. The one thing I leave you with is the Board of Supervisors really welcome the collaboration on behalf of the technical staff. See all the county staff looking at this for infrastructure. I know that Karin didn't highlight it, but the biggest flood of recent memory was in '97, and '97 was a 25-year event, and it really impacted the Bitterroot and the Clark Fork rivers. The Lolo sewer plant was in jeopardy of being completely inundated. So these are the types of things that our public works teams and bridge people all need to be working on. The other thing is the gravel pits that were highlighted on the one near Reserve Street, and there's also an active gravel pit out by Fort Missoula near the old historic campus that, when the Bitterroot gets high, has been also very, very, very close to being inundated and captured. So with that said, I'll kind of leave it for the staff and for future collaboration. And Dave and Juan, you can be sure that I'll be giving you guys a call to debrief, and I'd love to include Josh in this as well. But really appreciate that, and I won't take any more of your time, but looking forward to more of the same. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Karin. We really appreciate it. And this will be one study that I'm sure we will actually not allow to collect dust on the shelf, but we'll do something with it.
Well, and Karin's mentioned this. We love the ongoing discussions that stem from these projects, and we don't like these to sit on the shelf either.
Fantastic.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thanks.
Everyone.
Thank you.
You bet.
Bye.
All right, goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.